Racist cop pours coffee on quiet black woman, unaware who her son is. Evelyn Carter pushed open the door of the small-town cafe just as the morning sun began to spill across Main Street. The familiar jingle of the bell above the door rang out. But instead of warm greetings, the room seemed to grow quieter. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations stumbled and then resumed in hushed tones. Evelyn lowered her gaze, as if the tiles beneath her shoes were the only things that mattered. She had walked into this cafe many times before, but every time carried the same chill. She chose a seat by the window, a corner spot where the light fell soft across the table. Setting her worn handbag on the chair beside her, she folded her hands neatly in her lap. Her posture was upright, her expression calm, though her eyes lingered on the people around her. Two men at the counter turned their shoulders, speaking low. A woman with a stroller pretended to adjust her child's blanket while stealing a glance in Evelyn's direction. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, came over slowly. Her smile was polite but distant. Evelyn ordered a simple black coffee, her voice steady. She thanked the waitress, then let her gaze drift to the street outside. Cars rolled past, a bus stopped and started again. Life carried on as if nothing unusual was happening. Yet inside the cafe, the air felt tight, heavy with something unspoken. When the cup arrived, she lifted it carefully, letting the warmth settle into her palms. She took a small sip and closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the bitter taste. Around her, the sound of clinking dishes and murmured voices carried on, but there was an undercurrent, a watchfulness she couldn't ignore. She shifted slightly, brushing at the sleeve of her modest coat, and tried to focus on the quiet comfort of the drink. The door opened again with a sharp squeal of hinges. Boots struck the floor in a heavy rhythm. Evelyn looked up just briefly, long enough to see the uniformed figure filling the doorway. Officer Bradley. His presence immediately pulled the room's attention toward him. He stood tall, chest puffed, scanning the cafe like it belonged to him alone. His eyes landed on Evelyn, and his mouth curled into a thin, knowing smirk. She lowered her gaze once more, her hands tightening around the warm cup. Something in her chest stirred uneasily, though she remained still. The morning had begun quietly, but already it carried the weight of something waiting to break. Officer Bradley moved to the counter with a swagger that demanded attention. He spoke louder than necessary, joking with the man pouring his coffee, his voice booming across the room. His words weren't directed at Evelyn, yet every syllable carried an edge, sharp and deliberate. He laughed at his own remarks, the sound grating against the stillness of the cafe. A few customers forced polite chuckles, though most kept their heads down. Evelyn sat quietly by the window, her cup steady in her hands. She tried to focus on the steam rising from the coffee, but the sound of Bradley's laughter pressed against her ears. Her jaw tightened, though her face remained calm. She took another sip, slow and measured, as if her composure were a shield no one could touch. Bradley turned from the counter and made his way toward her table. His boots struck the tile hard, each step deliberate. As he passed, his elbow brushed hers, knocking her hand just enough for coffee to spill across her blouse. A hot splash spread over the fabric. He didn't pause to help, didn't offer an apology. Instead, he smirked, muttering, "Careful there, lady," as though it were her fault. Evelyn set her cup down, her fingers trembling slightly. She reached for a napkin, blotting at the stain, her movements slow and precise. Around her, the silence thickened. The young waitress looked up from behind the counter, her eyes wide, but she said nothing. Bradley returned to the counter, filled his own cup, and then, without hesitation, strolled back toward her. He paused at her table, tilting his wrist just so, and the dark liquid cascaded onto the surface. It spread quickly across the wood, dripping onto her handbag, soaking the edges. The smell of coffee filled the air, bitter and overwhelming. The cafe grew still. Forks rested on plates. Chairs creaked as people shifted, uneasy but unmoving. Bradley stood over her, his grin broad, his eyes daring anyone to challenge him. Evelyn's gaze followed the spreading stain on the table. She reached for her bag, lifting it gently out of the puddle, the leather darkened by the spill. Her breath came slow, steady, though her heart thudded beneath her chest. She did not look at Bradley. She did not speak. But the room could feel it. The line had been crossed. Evelyn's breath caught as the coffee dripped from the table to the floor in slow, steady drops. The cafe smelled of scorched bitterness, but she didn't move to clean it. Her hands rested on the damp fabric of her bag, her knuckles pale with strain. A flush of heat swept across her cheeks, though her face stayed still, as if carved from stone. Bradley leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. His words slithered into her ear. "People like you should know their place." His tone carried no pretense now, only the venom he'd been hiding beneath his grin. Evelyn's eyes fixed on the window, the world beyond blurred by streaks of condensation. She heard the clatter of a dish behind the counter, the nervous shuffle of a shoe against the floor. The young waitress stood frozen in place, her lips parted but silent. At a nearby table, an older man shifted uncomfortably, shaking his head before returning his gaze to his plate. The silence was heavier than the insult itself. Her fingers brushed at the wet edge of her sleeve. Then slowly, deliberately, she rose from her chair. The wooden legs scraped softly against the floor. She gathered her bag, waterlogged but held with care, and steadied herself. Her movements were unhurried, measured, as though dignity were her only shield. Bradley chuckled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What? No fight left in you?" His words rang against the cafe's walls, bouncing into every corner, forcing each listener to face the cruelty laid bare before them. He wanted laughter, approval, but the room offered none. Instead, there was a stillness that prickled like static in the air. Evelyn stood tall, her back straight, her chin lifted ever so slightly. Her eyes remained calm, though a storm churned deep behind them. She adjusted her bag over her arm, her blouse still damp, her hands steady now. She did not answer him. She did not give him the sound he wanted. The bell above the door rang again, cutting through the tension with a sharp, clear chime. Every head turned. Heavy footsteps entered, measured and strong, carrying with them a presence that shifted the weight of the entire room. Evelyn's heart stirred, her gaze lifting at last. Someone had arrived. The door closed with a low thud, and the cafe seemed to breathe differently. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, his shoulders broad, his stride calm and steady. He carried himself with quiet authority, the kind that made people sit up a little straighter without realizing why. Conversations hushed, forks hovered above plates, and eyes followed him as he moved further into the room. Evelyn stood by her table, her damp bag clutched close to her side. Her eyes met his for only a moment, and in that small exchange, her breath eased. He crossed the floor without hurry, every step measured, the sound of polished shoes tapping against tile. Bradley shifted, his grin returning as though nothing were out of place. He placed one hand on his belt, squaring his stance, blocking the stranger's view. He puffed up his chest. "You don't want to get involved, buddy. Just a little misunderstanding here." His tone carried false charm, but there was a hint of challenge underneath. The man's gaze lowered briefly to the table, where coffee still dripped to the floor, then to Evelyn's blouse, stained and clinging damp against her. His jaw tightened, though his expression remained calm. He stepped to her side, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. His voice was gentle, but it carried through the cafe. "Are you all right, Mom?" The words slipped into the air like a stone into still water. The ripples were immediate. Heads turned, glances darted, whispers rose and fell. "Mom." The connection was clear, yet the weight of it lingered in the silence. Evelyn nodded softly, the lines around her mouth easing for the first time that morning. She did not speak, but her eyes, calm and steady, told him everything he needed to know. Bradley gave a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Mom? Oh, that's rich." He looked the man up and down, dismissive, his smirk widening. "What are you gonna do? Write me a ticket?" His words were loud, meant for the room, meant to remind everyone of the badge pinned to his chest. But the room no longer carried his weight. All eyes were on the man in the suit. the one whose presence had turned the air electric. And Bradley, without knowing it, had already stepped far over the line. The cafe had gone silent. Even the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner seemed to fade. Marcus Carter stepped forward, his hand still resting lightly on his mother's shoulder. His eyes met Bradley's, steady and unwavering, his voice calm yet firm. "Officer, I'm Marcus Carter, newly appointed mayor of this city, and the woman you just humiliated is my mother." The words landed like a thunderclap. A stunned hush swept through the room, followed by the sound of muffled gasps. The young waitress covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide. At the counter, a man muttered under his breath, "Lord have mercy." Chairs shifted as people leaned forward, straining to catch every word. Bradley's face drained of color. His smirk faltered, then collapsed altogether. He stammered, fumbling for words, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. "I didn't mean... It was just a joke," he mumbled, glancing around the cafe as though someone might rescue him. But no one did. The weight of the title mayor hung heavy in the air, undeniable and final. Evelyn lifted her chin, her eyes meeting Bradley's for the first time. Her voice was soft, yet it cut through the silence like glass. "Dignity is stronger than hate. Remember that." She didn't raise her tone, but every syllable carried power. Bradley swallowed hard, his shoulders sagging as though the words themselves pressed him into the ground. Marcus guided his mother gently toward the door. The crowd parted, not a sound breaking the quiet, every set of eyes following them. The bell above the door chimed as they stepped outside, the morning sun spilling over them. For the first time that day, Evelyn breathed deeply, the air cool and refreshing against her skin. In the days that followed, word of what had happened spread quickly. The cafe was no longer remembered for its checkered floors or steaming pots, but for the morning silence broke. Bradley's badge was suspended, his arrogance no longer shielded by a uniform. People began to speak of Evelyn differently. She was no longer invisible. She was the woman who had stood in quiet strength, whose dignity had turned a moment of cruelty into a moment of truth. And as she walked down Main Street beside her son, she carried herself taller, her head held high, knowing she was finally seen.